They dismissed her as just another desk analyst, filing reports that real operatives didn't have time to read. But when a shadow network began systematically hunting down America's most valuable assets, this quiet support staffer would become the CIA's most lethal weapon, using skills her superiors never knew she possessed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the Liberty Crossing Intelligence campus hummed with their familiar electrical buzz, casting harsh shadows across rows of cubicles where analysts bent over computer screens like digital monks. The air carried the perpetual scent of stale coffee and printer toner, mixed with the barely perceptible ozone smell of overworked electronics. In cubicle 7G, tucked between a broken water cooler and a stack of forgotten filing cabinets, Zara Okafor stared at her monitor with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining an X-ray. Her government-issued badge hung from a retractable cord. The photo showing a woman with sharp cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes, though the job title printed below reads simply, Intelligence Analyst Level 2. What the badge didn't reveal was that those same eyes had once tracked insurgent movements through the mountains of Afghanistan, or that the steady hands now typing analysis reports had once assembled explosive devices for controlled demolitions behind enemy lines. The pattern on her screen was subtle, so subtle that most analysts would have dismissed it as statistical noise. A series of seemingly unrelated incidents across Eastern Europe, a diplomat's car accident in Prague, a journalist's sudden heart attack in Budapest, a businessman's disappearance in Warsaw. Each event separated by hundreds of miles and weeks of time, each attributed to natural causes or random crime. But Zara saw what others missed, the mathematical precision hidden within the chaos. She pulled up a secondary monitor, cross-referencing the incidents with classified asset movement reports. Her security clearance was high enough to access the data, though she doubted anyone expected her to actually use it. Support staff were supposed to run routine queries and file standard reports, not conduct independent analysis that might upset the established order. The correlation coefficient was undeniable, 0.97. In intelligence analysis, anything above 0.8 was considered significant. This was smoking gun territory. Okafor, the voice cut through her concentration like a blade. Section Chief Gregory Whitman stood beside her cubicle, his expensive suit and Harvard MBA demeanor radiating the kind of authority that came from briefing senators rather than crawling through Afghan caves. His pale blue eyes swept dismissively over her workspace, the multiple monitors, the hand-drawn charts, the stack of printed reports she'd been cross-referencing the old-fashioned way. Yes, sir? Zara minimized her analysis windows, though she left the correlation data visible on her secondary screen. I need those quarterly assessment reports by 5. The ones on regional communication patterns. His tone suggested he was addressing a particularly slow secretary rather than a former Marine intelligence specialist with 2 bronze stars. Sir, I've been working on something more urgent. There's a pattern emerging in the asset movement data. That suggests, Okafor. Whitman's interruption carried the finality of a judge's gavel. Your job is to compile quarterly reports, not to play detective with classified information. Leave the actual analysis to people who are qualified for it. Behind Whitman, Operations Director Frank Brennan approached with the swagger of a man who'd never met a mirror he didn't like. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his tie knotted with military precision, and his smile carried all the warmth of a corporate layoff notice. Where Whitman was dismissive, Brennan was actively condescending. What's our little support analyst trying to solve today? Brennan asked, his voice loud enough to carry across several cubicles. Don't tell me she's trying to do our jobs again. Zara felt the familiar heat creep up her neck, but her expression remained neutral. 3 years of this. 3 years of being treated like an intern who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong building. I've identified what appears to be a systematic elimination pattern targeting our European assets. The statistical correlation suggests coordinated. Statistical correlation, Brennan repeated, his voice dripping with amusement. Did you hear that, Greg? She's running statistical correlations. What's next? Predictive modeling. Several nearby analysts had stopped typing to listen. Zara could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others embarrassed on her behalf, most simply relieved that they weren't the target of Brennan's attention. Sir, with respect, I have extensive experience in pattern recognition from my time in marine intelligence. The data clearly shows, Okafor, Whitman interrupted again, this time with the patience of a parent explaining why children can't have candy for breakfast. Your marine experience was what? Analyzing radio intercepts in some forward operating base? This is strategic intelligence analysis. It requires years of specialized training and security clearances you simply don't have. The lie stung because it was so casually delivered. Zara's clearance level was actually higher than several of the real analysts in the room, earned through 5 years of combat intelligence work that had saved more lives than Whitman's quarterly reports ever would. But pointing that out would only make things worse. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I'll have those quarterly reports ready by 5. Brennan chuckled and patted Whitman on the shoulder. Good thing we've got the real analysts handling the important stuff. Can you imagine if we left national security to support staff? We'd probably end up chasing conspiracy theories and connecting dots that don't exist. As the two men walked away, their laughter echoing off the cubicle walls, Zara turned back to her screen. The correlation data was still there, cold, mathematical, undeniable. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, American assets were being systematically eliminated with surgical precision. The pattern was accelerating, the time between incidents decreasing. And the two men responsible for protecting those assets had just dismissed the warning as the delusions of an overeager support clerk. She opened a new window and began typing her quarterly report, fingers moving automatically across the keyboard, while her mind worked on a different problem entirely. The official CIA hierarchy said she was nobody, a former Marine who'd been shuffled into analysis work because she wasn't suitable for real operational duties. Her job description said she was supposed to compile reports and run routine database queries, but the data didn't lie. Assets were dying, and she was the only one who saw the pattern dot in 6 hours. She would submit her quarterly report exactly as requested, but tonight she would do something else entirely. Tonight, she would prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones nobody sees coming. The soft hum of electronics continued around her as Zara began to plan. In cubicles throughout the room, her colleagues typed away at their keyboards, processing intelligence that would be analyzed by their superiors, filed in appropriate channels, and acted upon by qualified personnel. None of them knew that the quiet woman in cubicle 7G was about to become the most valuable asset the CIA had ever produced. And none of them knew that before this was over, the men who had dismissed her would be begging for her help. The pattern was clear. The threat was real. And Zara Okafor was done being ignored. The secure conference room on the 7th floor felt like a tomb at 6:30 a.m. Zara clutched her printed analysis against her chest, the pages still warm from the printer she'd commandeered in the basement to avoid questions. She'd spent the entire night refining her data, cross-referencing timestamps, building an airtight case that even Whitman couldn't dismiss. The morning intelligence briefing was supposed to be routine, a quick rundown of overnight developments before the real analysts got to work. Zara had never attended one before. Support staff weren't usually invited to strategic planning sessions, but she'd used her security credentials to access the meeting schedule and simply shown up. Sometimes she'd learned in the Marines you had to create your own opportunities section, Chief Whitman entered with his usual parade of subordinates, each carrying tablets and coffee cups like digital age courtiers. His eyes swept the room and stopped when they found Zara sitting quietly in the back corner. "Okafor, what are you doing here?" His tone carried the irritation of a man discovering an uninvited guest at his dinner party. "Sir, I have urgent intelligence regarding the European asset situation. The pattern I identified yesterday has developed further overnight. The quarterly reports, Okafor. Did you finish the quarterly reports I assigned you?" "Yes, sir, but this is more important. We have active assets in imminent danger, based on more important than your assigned duties." Whitman's voice carried across the room like a whip crack. The other analysts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, studying their tablets with sudden fascination. Operations Director Brennan chose that moment to make his entrance, accompanied by two senior analysts whose names Zara knew, but whose attention she'd never commanded. Deputy Chief Marcus Holloway and Senior Analyst Patricia Webb, the real players in the intelligence game, the ones whose recommendations actually mattered. "Sorry I'm late," Brennan announced, settling into his chair with the casual authority of inherited power. "I see we have a full house today. Even support staff is joining us." His eyes found Zara with the precision of a targeting system. "Actually," Zara said, standing up with her analysis clutched in front of her like armor, "I need to brief everyone on a critical threat pattern I've discovered. Our European assets are being systematically eliminated according to a mathematical progression that suggests—" "Sit down, Okafor." Whitman's command cut through her words like a blade. "This is a senior staff briefing, not amateur hour." But Zara remained standing. 5 years of marine intelligence had taught her that sometimes you had to hold your ground, even when outranked. "Sir, with respect, I have data showing that 7 assets have been compromised in the past 3 weeks. The elimination pattern follows a specific geographic and temporal sequence that indicates inside knowledge of our operational structure." Brennan leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth like a cat watching a mouse. 7 assets? According to our reports, we've had 2 routine casualties in Eastern Europe, natural causes and random crime. Nothing suggesting coordinated action. That's because the connections aren't being analyzed properly, Zara replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. When you overlay the casualty reports with asset movement patterns and communication logs, the correlation becomes undeniable. She moved toward the conference table, pulling out her printed charts. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of morning traffic outside. Agent Thompson in Prague supposedly, a car accident. But the timing coincides exactly with his scheduled contact with Asset Miller. Agent Rodriguez in Budapest, heart attack at 35 with no medical history. But his death occurred 12 hours before a planned intelligence exchange. Deputy Chief Holloway glanced at the charts, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to genuine concern. "Where did you get access to operational movement data?" "My clearance level allows access to cross-reference databases for analytical purposes," Zara replied, which was technically true if you interpreted the regulations creatively. "Your clearance level," Brennan repeated slowly, "allows you to compile quarterly reports and run routine database queries. It does not authorize independent operational analysis or strategic threat assessment." Senior Analyst Webb finally spoke up, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone who'd spent 20 years navigating CIA politics. "Even if your analysis were accurate, which I doubt, asset casualties are handled by the Operations Directorate. Support staff don't develop threat assessments." "But what if the support staff is right?" Zara asked, her frustration finally bleeding through her professional composure. "What if there's actually a systematic elimination program targeting our European network, and everyone's too concerned with organizational charts to notice?" The silence that followed was deafening. Whitman's face had gone pale, then red, then a shade of purple that suggested cardiovascular distress. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and deadly. Okafor, you are clearly confused about your role in this organization. You are not an operational analyst. You are not a strategic planner. You are support staff. Your job is to compile data that qualified personnel can analyze and act upon. Brennan nodded approvingly. Exactly right. And frankly, this kind of overreach is exactly why certain types of personnel don't advance in intelligence work. You can't just waltz into a senior briefing and start making wild accusations based on amateur pattern recognition. It's not amateur. Zara said quietly, I have a master's degree in computational analysis and 5 years of combat intelligence experience. The mathematical correlation is 0.97. That's statistically impossible to achieve through random chance. Combat intelligence, Webb repeated with barely concealed disdain. Meaning what exactly? Counting IED components? Tracking supply convoys? That's hardly relevant to strategic intelligence analysis. The condescension in her voice was like physical blow. Zara had spent 5 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, identifying threat patterns that had saved hundreds of American lives. She'd tracked terrorist networks through communications intercepts, predicted attack patterns through behavioral analysis, and developed intelligence protocols that were still being used by Marine units overseas. But none of that mattered here. Here, she was just support staff who'd forgotten her place. Furthermore, Whitman continued, his voice gaining strength as he sensed victory, this kind of unauthorized data mining raises serious security concerns. I'm recommending a full review of your access privileges and a formal reprimand for exceeding your operational authority. Zara felt the walls closing in around her. Around the table, faces that had been merely dismissive were now openly hostile. She'd committed the cardinal sin of making her superiors look incompetent, and the institutional response was swift and merciless. Yes, sir, she said quietly, gathering her printed analysis. I apologize for the disruption. As she walked toward the door, Brennan's voice followed her like a parting shot. Okafor, in the future, remember that there's a reason support staff aren't involved in operational decisions. Leave the actual intelligence work to people who are qualified for it. The door closed behind her with a soft click, cutting off the resumption of normal briefing activities. Zara stood in the empty hallway, her analysis clutched against her chest, listening to the muffled sounds of a meeting that would proceed without her input. 7 assets were going to die. She was certain of it. The pattern was accelerating, and now she had no way to warn anyone who mattered, but she was a Marine. Marines didn't abandon their mission just because the command structure was broken. She walked back toward the elevator, her mind already working on alternative approaches. If the CIA wouldn't listen to her analysis, maybe it was time to prove it in a way they couldn't ignore. The emergency alert came at 3:17 a.m., 2 days after Zara's humiliation in the conference room. Her secure phone buzzed with the sharp, insistent tone reserved for critical intelligence updates. She rolled out of bed in her Arlington apartment, instantly awake with the reflexes of someone who'd spent years responding to midnight crisis calls. The message was brief and devastating. Asset Nightingale compromised. Vienna station requests immediate extraction protocols. Zara's blood turned to ice. Agent Sarah Kim Nightingale was one of the assets she'd identified as being in the kill zone. According to her analysis, Kim should have been the next target, scheduled for elimination within 72 hours of the Budapest incident. The timing was exactly as her mathematical model had predicted. She threw on clothes and drove to Liberty, crossing through empty pre-dawn streets, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Kim had simply blown her cover through operational error. Maybe it was random chance. Maybe her analysis was wrong, and she was seeing patterns where none existed. But when she badged into the building and made her way to the operations floor, the activity level told her everything she needed to know. The 7th floor buzzed with urgent energy analysts hunched over workstations, secure phones ringing constantly, senior staff moving between offices with the kind of controlled panic that indicated a major crisis. Zara slipped into her cubicle and accessed the overnight intelligence reports. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Kim wasn't just compromised, she was missing. Her last communication had come from a safe house in Vienna's 2nd district. When backup arrived 4 hours later, they'd found evidence of a struggle. Blood on the floor and signs of professional extraction. The official assessment, according to the preliminary report, was that Kim had been exposed through operational carelessness. Poor tradecraft, insufficient operational security, the kind of mistakes that young operatives sometimes made in high-stress situations. But Zara knew better. Kim was one of the CIA's most careful operatives, a woman who'd spent 3 years building her cover identity with methodical precision. She didn't make careless mistakes. She'd been targeted because someone with access to operational intelligence was feeding information to hostile forces. Zara pulled up her analysis files and updated them with Kim's disappearance. The correlation coefficient jumped to 0.98. The pattern was now undeniable, even to statisticians who specialize in finding flaws in data interpretation. "Rough night for Vienna Station," a voice said behind her. Zara turned to find Nicole Park, one of the junior analysts who worked in counterintelligence. Park was young, ambitious, and smart enough to recognize patterns when they were presented clearly. "You heard about Nightingale?" Zara asked, hard not to. "The whole operations directorate is in crisis mode. Brennan's been in emergency meetings since 4 a.m. Park lowered her voice. "Word is they're pulling all assets out of Austria, pending a security review." Zara felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. All assets? That's exactly what they want. What who wants? For a moment, Zara considered explaining everything to Park, the mathematical analysis, the systematic elimination pattern, the predictive model that had accurately forecasted Kim's compromise. But Park was junior staff, barely 2 years out of graduate school. Even if she believed the analysis, she didn't have the access or authority to do anything about it. "Nothing," Zara said, just thinking out loud. But as Park walked away, Zara's mind was already racing ahead to the next logical step. If the hostile forces were systematically compromising American assets, and if the CIA's response was to pull all assets from affected regions, then the enemy was achieving their strategic objective without firing the shot. They were dismantling America's intelligence network one careful elimination at a time. She opened a new analysis window and began modeling the next probable targets. Based on the geographic progression and operational patterns, the hostile forces would likely move to either Czech Republic or Poland within the next week. The most vulnerable assets would be those with the deepest cover, the long-term penetration agents, who'd spent years building their legends. The analysis pointed to 3 high-probability targets: Agent Michael Torres in Prague, Agent Lisa Chen in Krakow, and Agent David Williams in Gdansk. All 3 were veteran operatives with access to sensitive intelligence. All 3 fit the profile of previous victims. Zara printed out her analysis and walked toward the elevator. She knew what would happen when she tried to present this information to Whitman or Brennan. They'd dismiss it as the paranoid fantasies of support staff who didn't understand operational realities. They'd focus on her unauthorized access to classified databases rather than the substance of her warnings. But she had to try. The 7th floor operations center looked like a war room. Large displays showed maps of Eastern Europe marked with red zones indicating compromised areas. Analysts worked in clusters around computer terminals, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of classified databases. In the center of it all, Whitman and Brennan stood over a conference table covered with printed reports and satellite photographs. Zara approached them with her analysis in hand, her heart pounding but her expression composed. "Sir, I have updated intelligence on the asset compromise pattern. Based on the Vienna incident, I can predict the next probable targets with high statistical confidence." Whitman looked up from the conference table, his face flushed with stress and caffeine. "Okafor, what are you doing on the operations floor? Support staff aren't authorized in this area during crisis operations." "Sir, Agent Kim's compromise fits exactly into the pattern one identified earlier this week. The mathematical model I developed predicted her targeting within a 72-hour window. I can use the same model to identify the next assets at risk." Brennan straightened up, his eyes narrowing with barely controlled fury. "Are you seriously suggesting that you predicted Nightingale's compromise? That's either the most arrogant claim I've ever heard, or you know something about this operation that you shouldn't." The implication hit Zara like a physical blow. Brennan wasn't just dismissing her analysis, he was suggesting she might be involved in the security breach. Around the room, other analysts had stopped working to listen to the confrontation. "Sir, I'm trying to help. The pattern analysis clearly shows. The pattern analysis shows that you have unauthorized access to operational intelligence and an unhealthy obsession with classified information." Whitman interrupted. "Security, I want analyst Okafor escorted from this floor immediately. And I want a full investigation into how she obtained details about Vienna station operations." Two security officers appeared at Zara's elbows, their presence both polite and unmistakably firm. She looked around the room at faces that had shifted from mere dismissal to open suspicion. In trying to help, she'd managed to make herself look like a security threat. "Sir, please just look at the data," she said as the security officers began guiding her toward the elevator. "Torres in Prague, Chun in Krakow, Williams in Gdansk. They're the next targets. The pattern is clear if you just—" "Okafor," Brennan called after her, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "Consider yourself suspended, pending a security investigation. You're not to access any classified systems or enter any restricted areas until further notice." The elevator doors closed, cutting off her view of the operations center. Zara stood between the two security officers, her analysis clutched uselessly in her hands. She'd tried to save American lives and had instead been branded as a potential traitor. But as the elevator descended toward the main floor, her mind was already working on alternative approaches. She had 48 hours before the next asset would be compromised, according to her model. The CIA wouldn't listen to her warnings, but that didn't mean she was helpless. She was a Marine. Marines adapted, improvised, and overcame. And right now, 3 American operatives were depending on someone to see the pattern that everyone else was missing. The elevator doors opened, and Zara walked toward the exit, her badge already deactivated, but her resolve stronger than ever. If the CIA wouldn't use her analysis to save lives, she'd find another way. The emergency session in conference room Alpha felt like a tribunal. Zara sat alone at one end of the polished mahogany table, facing a panel of CIA leadership that represented the institutional power she'd spent 3 years trying to navigate. The room's soundproof walls and windowless design created an atmosphere of claustrophobic authority, where careers were made and destroyed with clinical efficiency. Deputy Director Amanda Cross presided over the hearing with the cold precision of a federal judge. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they swept over the assembled personnel. To her right sat Section Chief Whitman, his face bearing the satisfaction of a man about to be vindicated. Operations Director Brennan lounged in his chair with predatory confidence, occasionally glancing at Zara with barely concealed contempt. The formal charges were read with bureaucratic precision, unauthorized access to classified databases, exceeding operational authority, interfering with ongoing intelligence operations, and potential security violations. Each accusation hit like a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the career she'd built from nothing. Analyst Okafor, Deputy Director Cross began, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in intelligence work. You stand accused of serious violations of CIA protocol and federal security regulations. Before we proceed with disciplinary measures, you have the opportunity to explain your actions. Zara straightened in her chair, drawing on every ounce of military bearing she'd learned in Marines. Ma'am, I identified a systematic threat to American intelligence assets and attempted to alert my superiors through proper channels. When my warnings were ignored, I continued my analysis to prevent the loss of American lives. Proper channels? Brennan leaned forward, his voice dripping with theatrical incredulity. You mean disrupting senior staff meetings and making wild accusations based on amateur statistical analysis? The statistical correlation was 0.98, sir. That's mathematically impossible to achieve through random chance. Correlation is not causation, Senior Analyst Webb interjected from her position along the wall. Any first-year graduate student knows that basic principle. You've confused coincidence with conspiracy. Deputy Director Cross consulted the file in front of her. According to your personnel record, you have a background in marine intelligence. However, combat intelligence and strategic analysis are entirely different disciplines requiring different skills and training. Ma'am, pattern recognition is pattern recognition. The mathematical principles don't change based on the environment. Whitman's laugh was harsh and dismissive. There's the arrogance we've been dealing with for 3 years. She actually believes that counting IEDs in Afghanistan qualifies her to analyze strategic intelligence threats. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement from the assembled staff. Zara felt the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up her neck, but she forced herself to remain calm. These people had already decided her fate. This hearing was just theater. Furthermore, Brennan continued, pulling out a thick folder, we've discovered that analyst Okafor has been systematically accessing databases beyond her authorization level. Asset movement reports, operational communications, classified threat assessments, all obtained through what can only be described as deliberate security violations. My clearance level provides access to those databases for analytical purposes, Zara replied, though she knew the defense was weak. The regulations were deliberately vague about what constituted appropriate use. Your clearance provides access for compiling quarterly reports, Cross said sharply. Not for conducting unauthorized intelligence operations or developing strategic threat assessments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Senior Analyst Patricia Webb stepped forward, her expression mixing professional concern with personal disdain. Deputy Director, I've reviewed Okafor's so-called analysis, and it's frankly embarrassing. She's taken a series of unrelated incidents and imposed a mathematical framework that supports her preconceived conclusions. This is exactly the kind of amateur hour thinking that damages our credibility with foreign intelligence partners. The Vienna incident proved. My analysis was correct, Zara said quietly. Agent Kim was compromised exactly as my model predicted. Agent Kim was compromised due to operational carelessness, Brennan snapped. The kind of random security failure that happens in high-stress environments. Trying to claim credit for predicting it is either delusional or suspicious. The word suspicious hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around the table, Zara could see the shift in atmosphere as her colleagues began considering the possibility that she wasn't just incompetent, she might be dangerous. Let me ask you directly, Analyst Okafor, Deputy Director Cross said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. How did you know to focus on Agent Kim specifically? What led you to identify her as a target before her compromise occurred? The question was a trap, and Zara knew it. If she explained her analytical methodology, she'd be admitting to unauthorized database access on a massive scale. If she refused to answer, she'd look like she was hiding something suspicious. Ma'am, the mathematical model identified her as statistically likely to be targeted based on operational patterns and geographic progression. The hostile forces were following a systematic elimination protocol that made certain assets more vulnerable than others. Hostile forces, Webb repeated with barely concealed derision. You're talking about imaginary enemies conducting imaginary operations based on imaginary patterns. This is paranoid conspiracy thinking, not intelligence analysis. Whitman leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man watching his enemy destroy herself. Deputy Director, this is exactly what I've been trying to explain for months. Okafor has an unhealthy obsession with being right, with proving she's smarter than everyone else. She creates elaborate theories to support her need for attention and validation. That's not true, Zara said, her professional composure finally cracking. I'm trying to save lives. 3 more assets are going to be compromised in the next 48 hours. Torres in Prague, Chun in Krakow, Williams in Gdansk. The pattern is clear if you just look at the data objectively. The silence that followed was deafening. Cross studied Zara with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. When she spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. Analyst Okafor, you just named 3 active intelligence assets and their current operational locations in front of a room full of personnel. Do you understand the security implications of what you've just done? Zara's blood turned to ice. In her desperation to make them understand, she'd committed the ultimate sin compromising operational security. Even if her analysis was correct, even if those assets were in danger, she'd just violated every protocol about protecting agent identities. Ma'am, you were trying to prove how smart you are. Brennan interrupted, his voice filled with triumph. And in the process, you've potentially compromised 3 active operations. This goes beyond incompetence into potential treason. Around the room, faces that had been merely dismissive were now openly hostile. She'd gone from being an annoying subordinate to being a genuine security threat in the span of 30 seconds. Deputy Director Cross closed the file in front of her with finality. Analyst Okafor, you are hereby terminated from employment with the Central Intelligence Agency, effective immediately. Your security clearance is revoked, and you are banned from all CIA facilities pending a full security investigation. She stood, and the rest of the room followed suit like a choreographed ritual of institutional rejection. Furthermore, you will surrender all government property and submit to debriefing with the Office of Security. Any attempt to contact current or former intelligence assets will be treated as a federal crime. Zara remained seated as the room emptied. Around her, leaving her alone with 2 security officers who had materialized as if by magic. 3 years of dedicated service, 5 years of combat intelligence experience, a master's degree in computational analysis, all of it reduced to a 30-minute humiliation ritual. But as the security officers escorted her toward the exit, Zara's mind wasn't focused on her destroyed career. Instead, she was thinking about 3 American operatives who had less than 48 hours to live, and an institution that was too proud to admit when support staff might be right. She was no longer CIA. But she was still a Marine. And Marines never left anyone behind. The security debriefing lasted 4 hours and felt like a form of psychological warfare designed to break whatever remained of Zara's spirit. They confiscated her government laptop, her secure phone, her building access cards, and even the small notebook where she'd sketched preliminary analysis diagrams. Each item was cataloged with bureaucratic precision, as if her thoughts themselves were classified material that needed to be contained. By the time she walked out of Liberty Crossing for the final time, the Virginia sun was setting over the Potomac, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of tracer fire over Kandahar. The metaphor felt appropriate. She was walking into a war zone, just a different kind than she'd known in Afghanistan. Her Arlington apartment felt hollow and strange after the institutional environment of CIA headquarters. The silence was oppressive. After 3 years of constant electronic humming, ringing phones, and urgent conversations, she poured herself a glass of bourbon, the good stuff she'd been saving for a promotion that would never come, and sat at her kitchen table with her personal laptop. The CIA had taken her government equipment, but they couldn't take her mind. Everything she needed was still there: the mathematical models, the pattern recognition algorithms, the analytical framework she'd developed over 5 years of tracking insurgent networks in combat zones. The specific details might be classified, but the methodology was hers. She opened a new spreadsheet and began reconstructing her analysis from memory. The pattern was burned into her consciousness with mathematical precision. 7 assets eliminated across Eastern Europe in a systematic progression that pointed to insider knowledge and operational sophistication. The hostile forces, whoever they were, had access to CIA movement schedules, safe house locations, and communication protocols. Agent Michael Torres in Prague. According to her model, he would be targeted within the next 36 hours. The progression suggested a Wednesday evening operation, probably at his secondary safe house in the Venerati district. Torres was a 12-year veteran with deep cover as an art dealer, the kind of long-term asset that took decades to develop and could never be replaced. Agent Lisa Chun in Krakow. Thursday morning, most likely during her routine contact with local assets, Chun ran a network of Polish intelligence sources that provided critical information about Russian military movements. Her elimination would blind American intelligence to Eastern European operations for months. Agent David Williams in Gdansk. Friday night, probably during his weekly security check at the harbor monitoring station, Williams tracked Russian naval activity in the Baltic Sea, intelligence that was vital to NATO operational planning. 3 assets, 3 American lives, 3 irreplaceable intelligence capabilities. Zara stared at the names on her screen, feeling the weight of certainty settle in her chest like a stone. She knew with the same mathematical confidence that had guided her through minefields in Afghanistan that these people were going to die. And there was no one left who would listen to her warnings. She picked up her personal cell phone and stared at it for a long moment. The CIA had made it clear that any attempt to contact active assets would be treated as a federal crime. They'd probably already flagged her phone number in their monitoring systems. One call to an operational number, and she'd be facing espionage charges instead of just termination. But Torres, Sheen, and Williams didn't know they were targets. They were going about their missions with the confidence of professionals who trusted their institutional support systems. They had no idea that somewhere in the shadows, hostile forces were tracking their movements with surgical precision. Zara stood up and walked to her bedroom closet, pushing aside civilian clothes to reach the storage box she kept in the back corner. Inside were items from her military service that she'd never quite been able to throw away. Her old Marine Corps uniforms, combat boots that had walked through 3 different countries, and a small metal case containing equipment that wasn't quite civilian and wasn't quite military. The communications gear was technically legal: enhanced radios, encryption devices, signal analysis equipment that could be purchased by private security contractors. She'd acquired it during her transition from military to civilian life, thinking she might work for a defense contractor before the CIA opportunity had come up. Now it represented her only connection to the operational world. She'd been exiled. From she set up the equipment on her kitchen table, creating an improvised intelligence station in her 1-bedroom apartment. The irony wasn't lost on her 3 years ago. She'd left the chaos of combat operations for the sterile professionalism of analytical work. Now she was preparing to go back into the field, but this time without institutional support, backup, or legal authority. The secure phone rang once, then went silent. Zara froze, listening to the oppressive quiet of her apartment. It rang again, 2 short bursts, then nothing. Someone was trying to reach her using the contact protocol she recognized from her Marine days. Emergency communication, unofficial. Channels, the kind of call that meant someone needed help outside normal command structures. She activated her signal, analysis equipment, and traced the call's origin. The number was bouncing through multiple international relays, but the underlying protocol structure was familiar. American intelligence, probably European station. Someone who knew enough about her background to use military communication procedures. The phone rang a 3rd time. This time, Zara answered, Okafor. Her voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. Thank God. The voice was male American, stressed to the breaking point. This is Torres. I think someone's been tracking my movements. My contacts are spooked, and I've had the same surveillance team on me for 3 days. Zara's blood turned to ice. Michael Torres, the Prague asset she'd predicted, would be targeted within 36 hours. Somehow he'd gotten her personal number and was reaching out for help through unofficial channels. Torres, how did you get this number? Chun gave it to me. She said you'd tried to warn people about a pattern, that you'd been shut down for asking the right questions. Listen, I think we're blown, all of us. The whole Eastern European network. The confirmation hit Zara like a physical blow. Chun was also reaching out, which meant she was aware of the threat. 2 of the 3 assets her model had identified were already sensing the danger. But the CIA wasn't listening to their concerns, any more than they'd listened to her analysis. Torres, where are you now? Safe house beta, but I don't think it's safe anymore. Someone knew I'd be here tonight. I've got eyes on the building. Professional surveillance, the kind that suggests serious resources. Zara looked at her laptop screen, where her mathematical model predicted Torres would be targeted at his secondary safe house in Vinarati. Safe house beta. The pattern was unfolding exactly as her analysis had projected. Torres, you need to move, now. Don't use any of your established protocols or contact any of your regular assets. Someone with access to CIA operational intelligence is feeding information to hostile forces. Jesus Christ. How high does this go? Zara stared out her apartment window at the lights of Washington, D.C., where the people who destroyed her career were probably sleeping peacefully in their suburban homes, confident that they'd eliminated a troublesome subordinate. They had no idea that their institutional arrogance was about to get American operatives killed. I don't know, she said quietly, but I'm going to find out. Okafor, I need help. Official channels aren't responding to our security concerns. Chun and Williams are in the same situation. We're isolated, exposed, and running out of options. For the first time in 3 years, Zara felt a sense of clarity settle over her like armor. The CIA had cast her out, branded her as a security threat, and dismissed her expertise as the delusions of an amateur. But 3 American operatives needed help, and she was the only one who understood the pattern that was hunting them. Torres, I'm coming to get you. The words came out before she'd consciously decided to say them. But as soon as they left her mouth, she knew they were true. She was going to Europe. She was going to extract 3 compromised assets using methods the CIA had forgotten. And she was going to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones nobody sees coming. Coming to get us? Okafor, you're not operational anymore. You don't have authority, backup, or resources. Zara smiled for the first time in days. Torres, I'm a Marine. We don't need authority to do what's right. The red-eye flight to Vienna departed Dulles at 11:47 p.m. giving Zara exactly 14 hours to prepare for an unauthorized extraction mission that would either save 3 American lives or land her in federal prison for the rest of her natural life. She moved through her apartment with the methodical precision of someone who'd packed for combat deployments, selecting items that wouldn't trigger airport security but could be repurposed for intelligence work. Her cover story was simple. Sarah Mitchell, freelance security consultant, traveling to Austria for a corporate risk assessment. She'd used variations of this identity during her transition from military to civilian life, and the documentation was solid enough to pass routine scrutiny. The CIA might flag her real name in their systems, but Sarah Mitchell could move freely through European airports without raising electronic alarms. The hardest part was the equipment. Everything she needed for the extraction was either illegal to transport internationally or would require explanations she couldn't provide. But 5 years of improvised operations in Afghanistan had taught her that the most effective tools were often the most mundane ones. A tourist's smartphone could become a surveillance device. A business traveler's laptop could crack encrypted communications. A consultant's briefcase could hide equipment that would make a CIA technical officer jealous. She packed 3 phones, one for her cover identity, one burner for emergency communications, and one modified with signal analysis software that could track hostile surveillance teams. Her laptop contained routing software disguised as business applications, capable of creating secure communication channels that bypass traditional intelligence monitoring. Most importantly, she carried a small device that looked like a portable battery pack but actually contained emergency extraction protocols she'd developed during her Marine service. The flight to Vienna was turbulent, both meteorologically and psychologically. Zara sat in seat 230A, staring out at the darkness over the Atlantic while her mind ran through operational scenarios. She was violating so many federal laws that she'd stopped counting after espionage, unauthorized foreign intelligence operations, and interference with official CIA activities. If this went wrong, she'd spend the next 20 years in a maximum security prison. But if she did nothing, Torres, Chun, and Williams would be dead within 72 hours. She used the flight time to study everything she could remember about European CIA operations. Station locations, safe house protocols, communication procedures, extraction routes, all information that was supposedly classified but had been discussed openly enough in briefings that she'd absorbed it through osmosis. The CIA security was ironclad against external threats, but surprisingly porous when it came to internal information sharing. Vienna International Airport at 6:30 a.m. was a symphony of controlled chaos. Business travelers rushing to morning meetings, tourists beginning European vacations, and the subtle presence of intelligence operatives from half a dozen countries conducting the eternal dance of espionage. Zara moved through customs with the confident boredom of a frequent business traveler, her documentation passing inspection without triggering any secondary screening. She took the city airport train to Wien Mitte, then switched to the U-Bahn for a circuitous route designed to identify any surveillance teams that might have picked her up at the airport. The techniques were old-school tradecraft sudden direction changes, strategic use of reflective surfaces, timing patterns that would force followers to reveal themselves. After an hour of counter-surveillance maneuvers, she was confident that no one was tracking her movements. The safe house Torres had mentioned, Safe House Beta, was located in Venerati, a residential district that provided good cover for intelligence operations. Zara approached the building using a route that kept her invisible to the surveillance team Torres had reported. She could see them now, 2 men in a parked Audi, positioned with perfect sight lines to the building's entrances. Professional work. The kind that suggested serious resources and training. But they were watching the building, not the surrounding area. Classic mistake of teams focused on target containment rather than operational security. Zara activated her signal analysis, equipment and immediately identified the hostile surveillance pattern. The team was using encrypted radio communications on a frequency that matched known Russian intelligence protocols. Not definitive proof of SVR involvement, but close enough to confirm her worst suspicions about the scope of the security breach. She circled the block twice, mapping sight lines and escape routes, before finding what she needed, a maintenance entrance to the building's basement that was invisible from the surveillance team's position. The lock was standard European residential security, sophisticated enough to deter casual intruders, but vulnerable to techniques she'd learned from CIA technical specialists. The basement smelled of heating oil and accumulated dust, with the kind of oppressive silence that suggested good soundproofing. Zara made her way to the service elevator, using her modified phone to hack the building's security system. The electronic locks were networked, a convenience feature that became a vulnerability when someone knew how to exploit it. Safe house. Beta was on the 4th floor, apartment 4C. Zara emerged from the service elevator into a hallway that felt empty despite the normal sounds of residential life. She could sense the presence of someone behind the reinforced door, the subtle, electromagnetic signature of active electronic equipment, the barely perceptible vibration of human movement. She knocked using the pattern Torres had specified during their phone call. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. Marine Morse code for the letter V, a signal that would identify her as friendly while maintaining operational security. The door opened to reveal a man who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Michael Torres was in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered features that came from years of deep cover work. His eyes were alert despite his obvious exhaustion, and he held himself with the controlled tension of someone expecting violence. At any moment. "Okafor," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I said I would." Zara stepped into the apartment, automatically scanning for threats and escape routes. The space was spartanly furnished but equipped with serious communications gear, encrypted computers, secure phones, signal detection equipment that rivaled anything she'd used at Langley. "How bad is it?" she asked. Torres closed the door and engaged 3 separate locks. "Worse than I thought. The surveillance team has been in position for 18 hours. They've made no attempt to conceal their presence, which suggests they're not planning a subtle extraction." Chun and Williams? Same situation. Chun's got hostiles watching her apartment in Krakow. Williams hasn't checked in from Gdansk, which either means he's maintaining communication security or he's already been taken. Zara felt the familiar calm of operational focus settle over her. This was what she'd been trained for, not the bureaucratic warfare of CIA headquarters, but the immediate, life-or-death problem-solving of field operations. "Show me what you've got on the surveillance teams." Torres led her to a table covered with photographs and technical analysis printouts. The surveillance teams were professional, well-equipped, and coordinated across multiple countries. The kind of operation that required significant resources and high-level intelligence about CIA operational procedures. "This isn't random," Zara said, studying the photographs. "They're using our own protocols against us. Someone with access to operational planning is feeding them real-time intelligence. That's what Chun thinks too. She's been trying to warn Vienna Station, but they're treating her concerns as operational paranoia. Standard response when assets start seeing threats everywhere." Zara looked up from the photographs. "Torres, we're on our own. The CIA isn't going to help because they don't believe the threat is real. We need to extract all 3 of you using methods that bypass official protocols entirely." "Extract to where? And with what resources?" "You're not exactly traveling with a tactical team and diplomatic immunity." For the first time since leaving Washington, Zara smiled with genuine confidence. "Torres, I spent 5 years extracting compromised assets from hostile territory. The only difference is that this time, The hostile territory is supposed to be friendly. She pulled out her modified laptop and began typing rapidly. I'm going to show you something the CIA has forgotten. How to disappear completely using nothing but civilian resources and old-fashioned tradecraft. The screen filled with maps, transportation schedules, and communication protocols that had nothing to do with official intelligence channels. It was a shadow network built from tourist infrastructure, business travel routes, and civilian communication systems. Invisible to intelligence agencies, because it looked exactly like normal European commerce. We're going to extract you, Chun. And Williams in plain sight, Zara continued. No safe houses, no official resources, no backup from Langley. Just 3 compromised assets and 1 former Marine, who's tired of watching good people die because of institutional arrogance. Torres stared at the screen, his expression shifting from skepticism to hope. You really think this can work? Torres, I just flew to Vienna on 12 hours' notice to extract 3 people using equipment I bought at Best Buy and techniques I learned in Afghanistan. At this point, the hard part is over. Outside the apartment, the hostile surveillance team maintained their watch, confident that their target was trapped. They had no idea that the woman they were hunting had just become the hunter. The extraction of Michael Torres from Vienna required the kind of improvised brilliance that no CIA manual could teach. Zara spent 2 hours studying the surveillance team's patterns, timing their radio check-ins, mapping their sight lines, and identifying the critical flaw in their operational setup. They were watching for a traditional intelligence extraction, not a civilian tourist leaving for a morning shopping trip. At 9:30 a.m., Torres walked out the front door of his building wearing the clothes of a middle-aged art dealer heading to the Nashmarkt. He carried a canvas shopping bag, wore comfortable walking shoes, and moved with the unhurried pace of someone planning to spend the day browsing galleries and cafes. The surveillance team noted his departure, but didn't follow their orders. Were to maintain position and report movement, not to conduct active tracking. What they didn't see was Zara emerging from the building's basement 30 minutes later, dressed as a maintenance worker with coveralls and a toolkit. She'd spent the intervening time rerouting the building's security cameras and planting signal jammers that would create electronic dead zones in the surveillance team's communications. When Torres reached the Nashmarkt, he would be invisible to their tracking systems. The rendezvous point was a tourist coffee shop near the Danube Canal, chosen because it offered multiple exit routes and enough civilian traffic to provide cover. Torres arrived first, ordering a cappuccino and settling at a table with clear sight lines to the entrance. Zara entered 10 minutes later, now dressed as a business consultant with a laptop bag and the confident bearing of someone conducting routine corporate meetings. Status? She asked quietly, sitting across from Torres and opening her laptop as if reviewing business documents. Clean. No tail. No electronic surveillance. Your signal jammers worked perfectly. Torres sipped his coffee, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding area. Chun's situation is more complicated. The surveillance team in Krakow has been reinforced 6 operators, professional equipment, coordinated timing. They're not just watching her, they're preparing for active extraction. Zara's fingers moved across her keyboard, accessing the encrypted communication channel she'd established with Lisa Chun. The message that appeared on her screen confirmed Torres's assessment. Surrounded. Can't move without triggering immediate response. Need help. Time frame? Zara asked. Chung estimates 12 hours before they move on her. Williams hasn't responded to communications in 18 hours. Either he's maintaining strict operational security or he's already been taken. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than Zara had anticipated. 3 assets, 2 different countries, multiple hostile surveillance teams with coordinated timing. The kind of operation that would normally require a full CIA extraction team with diplomatic cover and unlimited resources. Instead, she had a former art dealer, a modified laptop, and techniques she'd improvised during 5 years of combat operations. Change of plans, Zara said, closing her laptop. We're not extracting you one at a time. We're going to hit all 3 locations simultaneously using a technique that will either save everyone or get us all killed. Torres raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Ever heard of the Prague Spring Protocol? Cold War extraction procedure. Supposedly used to pull assets out of Eastern Europe during the 1960s. Most people think it's a legend. Zara smiled. Most people are wrong. It's real, it works, and it's about to become very relevant to our situation. The Prague Spring Protocol was designed for exactly this scenario: multiple compromised assets, hostile surveillance, no official support. The technique involved creating a cascade of false emergencies that would overwhelm hostile intelligence capabilities while providing cover for simultaneous extractions. It had been declassified in the 1990s and forgotten by modern CIA operatives who preferred technological solutions to old-fashioned tradecraft. But Zara had studied every historical extraction method during her marine intelligence training. Sometimes the oldest techniques were the most effective because no one expected them to be used. Here's how it works, she explained, pulling up a secure map on her laptop. At exactly 14 o'clock hours, we trigger emergency protocols in Vienna, Prague, and Krakow simultaneously. Fire alarms, bomb threats, medical emergencies, anything that creates chaos and forces emergency response. The hostile surveillance teams will have to choose between maintaining their positions and responding to potential threats. And while they're confused, we extract the assets using civilian emergency procedures. Exactly. Chung leaves her apartment. During a fire evacuation, Williams, if he's still alive, gets extracted during a medical emergency. You disappear in the confusion of a bomb threat that forces everyone to evacuate a 6-block radius. Torres stared at the map, his expression shifting from skepticism to admiration. That's either brilliant or completely insane. In my experience, the two aren't mutually exclusive. The next 4 hours were a masterclass in improvised intelligence operations. Zara coordinated with Chun through encrypted channels, establishing timing sequences and extraction routes. She hacked into municipal emergency systems in 3 different cities, preparing to trigger coordinated responses that would create maximum confusion. Most importantly, she established contact with David Williams in Gdansk through a communications protocol that bypassed official CIA channels entirely. Williams was alive but trapped in a safe house surrounded by hostile surveillance. His situation was the most dangerous. The surveillance team had already attempted one extraction that he'd barely escaped. They were preparing for a second attempt using techniques that suggested serious escalation in their operational authority. Williams, this is Okafor. You remember me from the quarterly reports. The response came through after a long delay. The support analyst who got fired for asking inconvenient questions. What are you doing on an operational channel? Saving your life. In 3 hours, you're going to experience a medical emergency that requires immediate evacuation to the nearest hospital. Play along, and you'll be extracted using civilian medical procedures. Fight it, and you'll be dead by nightfall. Okafor, you're not operational. You don't have authority to run extraction protocols. Williams, in 3 hours you can either trust the support analyst who predicted the situation, or you can trust the institution that ignored her warnings and left you to die. Your choice. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Williams responded. What do you need me to do? At exactly 14 o'clock hours Central European Time, 3 cities experienced simultaneous emergencies that overwhelmed local intelligence monitoring capabilities. In Vienna, a bomb threat forced the evacuation of the Innenstadt district, creating chaos that lasted for 2 hours while authorities searched for explosive devices that didn't exist. In Krakow, a chemical spill in the old town triggered emergency protocols that required the evacuation of residential buildings, including the one where Lisa Chun had been under surveillance. In Gdansk, David Williams suffered an apparent heart attack that required immediate transport to the cardiac unit of the medical university hospital. The hostile surveillance teams faced an impossible choice: maintain their positions and risk exposure during emergency response operations, or abandon their missions to avoid compromise. In the confusion that followed, 3 American intelligence assets disappeared into the civilian infrastructure of European cities, extracted using techniques that predated modern surveillance technology by 50 years. By 1630, Torres, Chun, and Williams were aboard separate trains heading toward a rendezvous point in Prague that Zara had chosen for its historical significance. The same city where the original Prague Spring Protocol had been developed was about to witness its most successful modern application. But as Zara sat in her Vienna hotel room, monitoring the extraction through encrypted communications, she knew the real challenge was just beginning. She'd successfully extracted 3 compromised assets, but she'd also declared war on whatever organization was systematically eliminating American intelligence personnel. And unlike her targets, this enemy knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game was about to become significantly more dangerous. The secure satellite phone in Deputy Director Amanda Cross's Pentagon office rang at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time with the sharp, insistent tone reserved for operational emergencies. She answered on the second ring, instantly awake with the reflexes of someone who'd spent 30 years responding to international crises. "Cross, man, this is Vienna Station Chief Morrison. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." Cross sat up in her bed, reaching for the notebook she kept on her nightstand. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who didn't make panic calls unless the situation was genuinely critical. "What's the status?" "Ma'am, 3 of our assets who were under hostile surveillance have been successfully extracted using unauthorized procedures. Torres, Chun, and Williams are all safe and en route to a secure location." "Extracted by whom?" "I didn't authorize any extraction operations." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make Cross wonder if the connection had been lost. When Morrison spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of bewilderment and reluctant admiration. "Ma'am, according to preliminary reports, the extractions were conducted by former analyst Zara Okafor using techniques that appear to be based on historical CIA protocols." Cross felt the blood drain from her face. "Okafor, the support analyst, who was terminated 3 days ago for security violations?" "Yes, ma'am. The same one who tried to warn us about systematic asset elimination." "Ma'am, her predictions were accurate down to the hour." "Torres was scheduled to be taken tonight, Chun. Tomorrow morning, Williams was already missing and presumed captured." The implications hit Cross like a physical blow. The woman they'd fired for paranoid conspiracy theories had not only been correct about the threat, but had successfully conducted an unauthorized international intelligence operation that saved 3 American lives. Meanwhile, the CIA's official response had been to ignore the warnings and leave the assets to die. "Morrison, I want a full briefing in 6 hours. And I want every detail about how Okafor conducted these extractions. If she's operating outside official channels with that level of success, we need to understand her methodology." "Ma'am, there's more. The hostile surveillance teams that were tracking our assets, we've identified them as SVR operatives with sophisticated technical equipment. This wasn't random criminal activity or operational carelessness. Someone with access to our European operational structure was feeding intelligence to Russian handlers." Cross closed her eyes, feeling the magnitude of the security breach settle over her like a heavy blanket. Internal compromise? That's the working theory. The level of detail required to target these specific assets suggests someone with access. to movement schedules, safe house locations, and communication protocols. Ma'am, if Okafor hadn't intervened, we would have lost 3 of our most valuable European assets without ever understanding how they were being tracked. 6 hours later, the secure conference room at Langley felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been delivered. Deputy Director Cross presided over an emergency session that included everyone who had been involved in Okafor's termination, plus senior analysts who were frantically trying to understand how a fired support staff member had conducted a more successful intelligence operation than the entire European Directorate. Section Chief Whitman sat at the far end of the table, his face the color of old parchment. Operations Director Brennan studied his hands with the intensity of someone trying to become invisible. Senior Analyst Webb maintained her professional composure, but her eyes carried the haunted look of someone whose career had just suffered irreparable damage. "Gentlemen," Cross began, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in intelligence work, "I want explanations. 3 days ago, you convinced me to fire an analyst for making wild accusations about systematic asset elimination. This morning, I received confirmation that her accusations were not only accurate, but understated the scope of the threat." She activated the wall display, showing a map of Eastern Europe marked with red indicators for compromised assets and green indicators for successful extractions. Analyst Okafor predicted the exact timing and methodology of hostile operations against our European network. While we were dismissing her warnings as conspiracy theories, she was conducting unauthorized intelligence analysis that proved more accurate than our official assessments. Whitman attempted to salvage the situation. "Ma'am, even if her analysis was accidentally correct, her methods were inappropriate. She violated security protocols and exceeded her operational authority." "Her methods," Cross replied coldly, "saved 3 American lives that we were prepared to sacrifice through institutional arrogance. Torres, Chun, and Williams are alive because a support analyst was willing to violate protocol rather than watch her colleagues die." The preliminary after-action report made for devastating reading. Zara had identified the threat pattern using mathematical analysis that was more sophisticated than anything the CIA's official threat assessment team had produced. Her predictions had been accurate to within hours, her operational planning had been flawless, and her execution had demonstrated tradecraft skills that surpassed most operational personnel. Furthermore, Cross continued, consulting the report, Okafor's extraction methodology represents a significant advancement in non-official cover operations. She successfully extracted 3 assets from hostile surveillance using civilian infrastructure and historical protocols that our current operatives had forgotten existed. Operations Director Brennan finally spoke up, his voice carefully controlled. "Ma'am, with respect, Okafor's unauthorized operation could have resulted in international incidents. She had no diplomatic cover, no official support, no authorization from any government agency. And yet she succeeded where our official operations failed," Cross replied. "She identified threats we missed, predicted enemy actions we couldn't anticipate, and executed extractions we couldn't authorize. The question isn't whether her methods were orthodox, the question is why our orthodox methods failed so completely." Senior Analyst Webb made one last attempt at institutional damage control. "Deputy Director, even if Okafor's analysis was accurate, her psychological profile suggests someone with authority issues and a need for validation. This could be an elaborate attempt to prove her superiority rather than genuine concern for operational security." Cross stared at Webb with the kind of expression usually reserved for particularly incompetent junior officers. Analyst Webb, Zara Okafor, risked federal prosecution to save 3 American lives. She spent her own money, used her own resources, and operated without backup or official support because she believed that American intelligence personnel were worth saving. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the Virginia countryside. while she was conducting unauthorized operations in 3 different countries. Our official response was to file paperwork about her security violations. She extracted compromised assets using 50-year-old techniques because our modern methods had been compromised by hostile intelligence services. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of normal CIA operations continuing in other parts of the building. Cross turned back to face the assembled personnel, her expression mixing disappointment with cold fury. Effective immediately, Section Chief Whitman, you are relieved of operational duties pending investigation into your handling of the threat assessment. Operations Director Brennan, you will submit a comprehensive review of European security protocols and explain how Russian intelligence gained access to our operational structure. She consulted her notes one final time. Senior Analyst Webb, you will prepare a detailed analysis of Okafor's mathematical methodology and recommend improvements to our current threat assessment procedures. Ma'am, Whitman said quietly, what about Okafor herself? She's violated numerous federal statutes and international agreements. There have to be consequences for unauthorized intelligence operations. Cross smiled for the first time during the meeting. Oh, there will be consequences, Mr. Whitman, just not the ones you're expecting. She gathered her materials and headed toward the door. I have a phone call to make. It seems we have some apologizing to do, and a job offer that I suspect will be very interesting to discuss. As the door closed behind her, the remaining personnel sat in stunned silence, realizing that their attempt to destroy Zara Okafor's career had instead destroyed their own. The support analyst they'd dismissed as paranoid and incompetent had just demonstrated capabilities that made them look like amateurs. And somewhere in Europe, the woman they'd tried to silence was about to become the most valuable asset the CIA had ever recruited. The secure video call found Zara in a Prague safe house that existed nowhere in CIA records, a Cold War-era facility she discovered through historical research and reactivated using techniques that predated modern intelligence. Bureaucracy. She sat before her laptop camera wearing civilian clothes, her expression calm despite having spent the last 48 hours conducting unauthorized intelligence operations across 3 countries. Director Amanda Cross appeared on the screen with the bearing of someone preparing to eat a substantial portion of crow. Behind her, Zara could see the familiar conference room where she'd been humiliated 3 days earlier, a lifetime ago, when she'd been nothing more than dismissed support staff. Ms. Okafor, Cross began, her voice carrying a formality that acknowledged the fundamental shift in their relationship. I believe we need to talk. Yes, ma'am, Zara replied, noting the subtle change from analyst Okafor to Ms. Okafor, the difference between a subordinate and an equal. I assume this is about the European situation. The European situation, Cross repeated slowly. Is that what you're calling the most successful unauthorized intelligence operation in CIA history? Through the video connection, Zara could see other figures moving in the background of the Langley conference room. She recognized some faces, senior analysts and operations directors who had dismissed her warnings just days earlier. Their presence suggested this wasn't just a debriefing call, but a formal acknowledgement of institutional failure. Ma'am, I want to be clear about something from the start, Zara said. I didn't conduct these operations to embarrass the agency or prove anyone wrong. I did it because 3 American lives were at stake and no one else was listening to the analysis. Cross leaned forward slightly. Ms. Okafor, your mathematical model predicted the timing of hostile operations with precision that our best analytical teams couldn't match. Your extraction methodology demonstrated tradecraft capabilities that most of our operational personnel have never mastered. And you accomplished all of this while operating outside official channels with no institutional support. Ma'am, the techniques I used aren't revolutionary. They're based on historical procedures that were developed during the Cold War, and refined through 5 years of combat operations. The mathematical analysis was straightforward pattern recognition applied to intelligence data. Straightforward, Cross said with something that might have been amusement. Ms. Okafor, your straightforward analysis identified as systematic. Elimination program that our official threat assessment teams missed entirely. Your predictions were accurate to within hours, while our experts were debating whether random coincidences constituted a pattern. Zara could see movement behind Cross as other personnel entered the conference room. She recognized Station Chief Morrison, whom she'd never met but whose voice she'd heard during coordination calls. More importantly, she could see the conspicuous absence of certain faces. Whitman, Brennan, and Webb were nowhere to be visible. "Ma'am, where are Torres, Chun, and Williams now?" "Safe House Echo in Prague. They're being debriefed by a team that includes several people who are very interested in your operational methodology." Cross paused, consulting notes that Zara couldn't see. "All 3 assets have provided detailed accounts of the extraction procedures you used. They've also submitted formal recommendations that I think you should hear." The screen split to show a second video feed. Michael Torres appeared, looking considerably better than he had during their last face-to-face meeting in Vienna. Behind him, Zara could see Lisa Chun and David Williams' assets she'd saved but never met in person. "Okafor," Torres said, his voice carrying genuine warmth, "I wanted to thank you personally. Not just for the extraction, but for being the only person in the intelligence community who took the threat seriously enough to act on it." Chun leaned into the camera frame. "The mathematical analysis you provided was the most accurate threat assessment I've seen in 12 years of operational work. You predicted our compromise scenarios with precision that saved our lives." Williams nodded agreement. "More than that, your extraction methodology represents a significant advancement in non-official cover operations. You successfully extracted 3 assets from hostile surveillance using techniques that bypassed every security measure the opposition had in place." Cross resumed control of the conversation. "Ms. Okafor, I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing your personnel file, your mathematical analysis, and the after-action reports from this operation. What I've found is that we made a series of fundamental errors in judgment that nearly resulted in the loss of 3 valuable intelligence assets. Ma'am, institutional blindness isn't uncommon in large organizations. The important thing is that we learned from the experience and improved our threat assessment procedures." "Ms. Okafor, you're being remarkably generous considering how you were treated. Let me be blunt, we fired you for being right. We dismissed your warnings because they challenged our assumptions about how intelligence operations work. We treated you like an incompetent subordinate when you were actually the most competent analyst in the building." The formal acknowledgement hit Zara with unexpected emotional force. For 3 years, she'd endured dismissal, condescension, and systematic exclusion from meaningful work. She'd been treated like an inconvenient presence who didn't understand her place in the institutional hierarchy. "Furthermore," Cross continued, "your unauthorized operation demonstrated capabilities that we desperately need in our operational structure. You identified threats we missed, predicted enemy actions we couldn't anticipate, and executed extractions using methods that most of our personnel couldn't replicate." Cross consulted her notes again. "Which brings me to the reason for this call, Ms. Okafor. I'm offering you a position as Director of Advanced Analytical Operations, reporting directly to me with authority over threat assessment and non-conventional operational planning." The silence stretched across the video connection as Zara processed the magnitude of the offer. 3 days ago, she'd been fired as support staff. Now she was being offered a directorship with broad operational authority. "Ma'am, what about the legal issues? I violated numerous federal statutes and international agreements during the European operation." Cross smiled for the first time during the call. Ms. Okafor, you conducted a successful intelligence operation that saved American lives and identified a critical security breach. The Justice Department has reviewed your actions and determined that they fall under Emergency Operational Authority provisions. You're not facing charges, you're receiving a commendation. Torres's voice came through the audio channel. Okafor, take the job. The agency needs people who are willing to act when institutional procedures fail. We need analysts who can think outside the bureaucratic box. Shun added her voice. More than that, we need operational personnel who understand that sometimes the old methods work better than the new ones. Your combination of analytical capability and field tradecraft is exactly what modern intelligence work requires. Zara looked at the faces on her screen, people who had gone from dismissing her expertise to seeking her leadership in the span of 72 hours. The transformation was as dramatic as it was satisfying, but more importantly, it represented an opportunity to ensure that other qualified personnel wouldn't be dismissed simply because they challenged institutional assumptions. Ma'am, I accept the position, but I have some conditions regarding how analytical personnel are integrated into operational planning and how mathematical threat assessment is incorporated into official procedures. Cross nodded approvingly. I wouldn't expect anything less. We've learned that your unconventional approaches produce results that our conventional methods can't match. When do you want me to report for duty? Ms. Okafor, as far as I'm concerned, you've been on duty since the moment you identified the threat pattern. The question is when you want to make it official. Zara smiled, feeling a sense of professional fulfillment that had been missing during her years in the analytical basement. Ma'am, I think it's time to come home. Welcome back, Director Okafor. The CIA is lucky to have you. The video connection ended, leaving Zara alone in the Prague safe house with the knowledge that her exile was over. She was no longer the dismissed support analyst who haunted the forgotten corners of the intelligence community. She was the Director of Advanced Analytical Operations, with the authority to ensure that mathematical analysis and operational capability worked together rather than in opposition. But more importantly, she had proven that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones that institutions overlook, and that quiet competence will always triumph over loud arrogance. 6 months after her return to Langley, Director Zara Okafor stood in a conference room that bore no resemblance to the sterile, bureaucratic spaces where she'd once been dismissed as irrelevant support staff. The Advanced Analytical Operations Center occupied an entire floor of the Liberty Crossing facility, its walls lined with displays showing real-time intelligence feeds from 6 continents. The air hummed with focused energy as analysts worked alongside operational personnel, their expertise finally integrated rather than segregated. The morning briefing drew attendees that would have been unthinkable during her previous tenure. Station chiefs participated via secure video from London, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. Senior operational directors sat alongside mathematical analysts, their traditional hierarchy replaced by collaborative problem-solving. Most remarkably, former support staff now occupied positions of genuine authority, their technical expertise finally recognized as operationally valuable. Ladies and gentlemen, Zara began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than political maneuvering. This morning's intelligence indicates a coordinated effort by hostile forces to compromise our Southeast Asian network, using methodologies similar to the European operation we disrupted earlier this year. The wall displays shifted to show a 3-dimensional analysis of asset movements, communication patterns, and statistical correlations that painted a clear picture of systematic intelligence penetration. The mathematical precision was undeniable, but more importantly, it was being presented to an audience that understood its operational significance. Agent Sarah Kim, reporting from Bangkok Station, came a voice through the secure communication system. Kim had returned to operational duty after her Vienna extraction, but now she worked with analytical support that actually listened to field observations rather than dismissing them as operational paranoia. "Ma'am, the pattern matches exactly what we saw in Eastern Europe. Professional surveillance teams, coordinated timing, access to information that suggests internal compromise. But this time, we're ahead of the curve instead of reacting to casualties." Zara nodded approvingly. The integration of field intelligence with mathematical analysis had revolutionized CI, threat assessment procedures. Operational personnel no longer worked in isolation from analytical support, and analysts were no longer relegated to compiling reports that nobody read. "Agent Rodriguez, what's the status of our counter-surveillance operations?" Michael Torres appeared on one of the video screens, now serving as Chief of Counterintelligence Operations for European networks. His extraction from Vienna had led to a complete restructuring of how the CIA protected its overseas assets. "Ma'am, we've implemented the distributed surveillance protocol you developed, instead of relying on centralized safe houses that can be compromised en masse. Our assets now operate using civilian infrastructure that's invisible to traditional intelligence monitoring." The transformation wasn't just organizational, it was philosophical. The CIA had learned that its most valuable weapons weren't necessarily the most obvious ones. Support staff who understood pattern recognition were often more valuable than operational personnel who relied on institutional authority. Mathematical analysis could predict enemy actions more accurately than human intuition. Historical techniques could outperform modern technology when properly applied. "Director Okafor," came a voice from the back of the room. Zara turned to see Agent Jennifer Walsh, one of the junior analysts, who had been promoted to operational duty based on analytical capability rather than traditional qualifications. "The Bangkok surveillance team is using encrypted communications that match the frequency patterns we identified in the Russian operation. Should we implement jamming protocols?" "Negative. Let them maintain communications while we monitor their traffic." "Agent Kim, are you positioned to track their command structure?" "Affirmative, ma'am. We've identified what appears to be a coordination center in a commercial building downtown. The electronic signature suggests sophisticated equipment and multiple personnel." Zara studied the intelligence displays, her mind processing variables that would have overwhelmed traditional analytical approaches. The integration of human intelligence with mathematical modeling created a comprehensive understanding of hostile operations that was unprecedented in CIA history. "All stations, implement extraction protocol Delta. We're not waiting for casualties this time." The response was immediate and coordinated. Across Southeast Asia, American intelligence assets began moving according to predetermined patterns that would take them outside hostile surveillance capabilities. The extractions were conducted using civilian infrastructure, historical techniques, and most importantly, mathematical precision that eliminated guesswork from operational planning. The most significant transformation wasn't tactical, it was cultural. The CIA had finally learned to value competence over hierarchy, results over politics, and analytical capability over institutional tradition. "Ma'am," Agent Walsh continued, "the statistical model suggests this operation is being coordinated from a central location with access to our Asian operational databases. Do we have authorization to identify and neutralize the source?" Zara smiled, remembering when similar questions would have been dismissed as beyond the scope of support staff responsibilities. Now analytical personnel were authorized to develop operational recommendations based on mathematical certainty rather than institutional assumption. "Agent Walsh, prepare a comprehensive analysis of potential compromise vectors. I want to know who has access to the intelligence these hostile forces are using. And I want recommendations for neutralizing the threat at its source." The briefing continued for another hour, covering operations that spanned 3 continents, and involved analytical techniques that were reshaping modern intelligence work. When it concluded, Zara remained in the conference room as personnel, filed out to execute missions that would have been impossible under the old bureaucratic structure. Deputy Director Cross entered as the room emptied, her expression mixing satisfaction with something that might have been amazement. Director Okafor, your operational success rate is unprecedented in CIA history. 97% mission effectiveness, 0 asset casualties, and intelligence gathering that's revolutionized our understanding of hostile capabilities. Ma'am, the success comes from integrating analytical capability with operational authority. When support staff are treated as genuine intelligence assets rather than bureaucratic obstacles, the results speak for themselves. Cross consulted her tablet, scrolling through performance metrics that painted a picture of institutional transformation. The Pentagon is requesting briefings on your methodologies. State Department wants to implement similar approaches in diplomatic intelligence. Even NSA is asking for consultation on integrating mathematical analysis with signals intelligence. Ma'am, the techniques aren't proprietary. They're based on principles that should be standard throughout the intelligence community, listening to qualified personnel regardless of their position in the hierarchy, using mathematical analysis to supplement human intuition, and recognizing that sometimes the old methods work better than the new ones. Cross looked around the Advanced Analytical Operations Center, taking in the displays showing successful missions across multiple continents. Director, when we first offered you this position, I thought we were getting a talented analyst who had been underutilized. I didn't realize we were recruiting someone who would fundamentally change how American intelligence operates. Zara walked to the window overlooking the Virginia countryside, the same view she'd seen as dismissed support staff 6 months earlier. But now she was seeing it from a position of authority earned through competence, surrounded by personnel who valued results over rank. Ma'am, I didn't change anything fundamental. I just proved that the CIA's most valuable assets were already here. They were just being ignored by people who couldn't see past organizational charts and gender assumptions. And now? Now we have an intelligence service that actually uses intelligence. Mathematical precision combined with operational capability, analytical expertise integrated with field experience, and most importantly, an institution that listens to qualified personnel regardless of their background or position. Cross nodded approvingly. Director, you've become exactly what we needed, our deadliest asset, operating in plain sight, using weapons that no enemy can detect or counter. Zara smiled, thinking about the quiet support staff throughout the intelligence community who were still waiting for someone to recognize their capabilities. Ma'am, I'm not the deadliest asset. I'm just the first one you finally decided to listen to. And the others? They're out there, ma'am. Analyzing patterns, identifying threats, developing solutions that could revolutionize national security. All they need is someone willing to value competence over hierarchy. The transformation was complete, but it was also just beginning. Zara had proven that dismissed support staff could become invaluable operational assets. Now it was time to find the others. 2 years after the European extraction that changed everything, Director Zara Okafor stood before the assembled faculty of the CIA's Training and Development Center, addressing a room that represented the future of American intelligence. Audience included operational trainees, analytical specialists, technical personnel, and most importantly, individuals who had previously been overlooked by institutional hierarchies that valued rank over competence. The lecture hall buzzed with energy that would have been impossible under the old system. Women comprised 40% of the advanced training program. Minorities held leadership positions in every operational specialty, and former support staff taught courses on subjects ranging from mathematical threat assessment to historical extraction techniques. The transformation that had begun with one dismissed analyst had rippled throughout the entire intelligence community. "The most dangerous assumption in intelligence work," Zara began, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose unconventional methods had saved hundreds of American lives, "is that hierarchy equals expertise. The second most dangerous assumption is that traditional approaches are always superior to innovative ones." In the front row sat Agent Sarah Kim, now Director of Asian Operations, whose near capture in Vienna had sparked the investigation that revolutionized CIA procedures. Beside her, former analyst Jennifer Walsh wore the insignia of Chief of Counterintelligence, her mathematical background having proven invaluable in identifying hostile penetration attempts. 2 years ago, the CIA operated under a system that relegated analytical expertise to administrative support while operational authority remained concentrated among personnel who valued intuition over evidence. The results were predictable. We missed threats, lost assets, and reacted to enemy actions instead of anticipating them. The wall displays showed a map of global intelligence, operations marked with success indicators that told the story of institutional transformation. Asset survival rates had increased by 340%. Threat identification accuracy had improved by 280%. Mission success rates had reached levels that the old CIA would have considered impossible. The European extraction operation that many of you have studied wasn't successful because it used revolutionary techniques. It succeeded because it applied forgotten principles that institutional arrogance had discarded. Mathematical analysis, historical tradecraft, and most importantly, the willingness to listen to qualified personnel, regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. Michael Torres raised his hand from the middle of the room. Now Deputy Director of Global Operations, his experience as an extracted asset had shaped his understanding of how analytical support could enhance field operations. "Director, what advice would you give to personnel who identify threats that their superiors are unwilling to acknowledge?" Zara smiled, recognizing the question that went to the heart of institutional change. "Agent Torres, the first rule is to document everything. Mathematical analysis, statistical correlations, predictive models. Build a case that's so mathematically rigorous that dismissing it becomes professionally embarrassing. And if they dismiss it anyway, then you have a choice. You can accept institutional blindness and watch people die, or you can find alternative approaches that accomplish the mission while bypassing bureaucratic obstacles." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "But understand the consequences. Acting outside official channels requires accepting personal responsibility for results that institutional structures are designed to avoid." Agent Lisa Chun, now Station Chief for Eastern European Operations, contributed to the discussion from her position near the back of the room. "Director, the integration of analytical and operational personnel has revolutionized field intelligence. How do we ensure these improvements survive institutional pressure to return to traditional hierarchies?" Agent Chun, cultural change becomes permanent when it produces results that are impossible to ignore. The old system failed because it wasted human resources and ignored mathematical certainty. The new system succeeds because it values competence over politics. The questions continued for another hour, covering topics that ranged from tactical applications of historical techniques to strategic implications of mathematical threat assessment. But the underlying theme remained constant. The CIA had learned to recognize expertise wherever it existed, rather than limiting it to traditional career paths. After the session ended, Zara walked through the corridors of the training center, observing classes that would have been impossible under the old system. Former support staff taught operational planning. Mathematical analysts led field exercises. Personnel who had been dismissed as not operational material now trained the next generation of intelligence officers. The transformation extended beyond individual careers to fundamental changes in how American intelligence operated. The Okafor protocols, as they'd become known throughout the intelligence community, were now standard procedure for threat assessment and asset protection. The mathematical methodologies she developed were being taught at universities and implemented by allied intelligence services, but perhaps most importantly, the cultural shift had created an environment where qualified personnel were valued regardless of their background, gender, or position in the institutional hierarchy. The CIA had learned that its most valuable weapons weren't necessarily the most obvious ones. Deputy Director Cross found Zara in her office that evening, reviewing intelligence reports that painted a picture of American national security capabilities that were stronger than they'd been in decades. The success metrics were undeniable, but more importantly, they represented a foundation for continued improvement rather than temporary achievement. Director, I wanted to discuss the State Department's request for consultation on diplomatic intelligence integration. They're specifically asking for expertise in identifying personnel whose capabilities exceed their current assignments. Zara looked up from her reports, considering the implications of extending the institutional transformation beyond the CIA. Ma'am, how many other agencies are operating under the same assumptions that nearly cost us Torres, Chun, and Williams? According to preliminary assessments, most of them. The State Department has analytical personnel in administrative positions who could be developing threat assessments. Defense Intelligence has support staff with operational capabilities that aren't being utilized. Even the Secret Service has mathematical analysts who are relegated to paperwork instead of protective intelligence. The scope of the opportunity was staggering. Throughout the federal government, qualified personnel were being underutilized because institutional hierarchies couldn't recognize expertise that didn't fit traditional categories. The same blindness that had dismissed Zara as incompetent support staff was wasting human resources across the entire national security apparatus. Ma'am, I think it's time to expand the program. The principles that transformed the CIA can revolutionize American intelligence capabilities if we're willing to challenge institutional assumptions wherever they exist. Cross nodded approvingly. Director, you've proven that the most extraordinary achievements come from recognizing ordinary competence that's been systematically overlooked. The question is whether other agencies are ready for that kind of institutional transformation. Zara stood and walked to her window, looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C., where thousands of qualified personnel were probably sitting in positions that didn't utilize their full capabilities, dismissed by supervisors who couldn't see past organizational charts and traditional assumptions. Ma'am, 2 years ago, I was just support staff filing quarterly reports that nobody read. Today, I'm directing operations that are reshaping American intelligence capabilities. If that transformation is possible, then anything is possible. And the future? The future belongs to institutions that value competence over hierarchy, evidence over assumption, and results over politics. We've proven that the most dangerous weapons are often the ones that traditional thinking overlooks. Cross smiled, recognizing the truth in words that had been proven through mathematical precision and operational success. Director, you didn't just save 3 assets in Europe. You saved an entire institutional culture from its own arrogance. Zara returned to her desk, surrounded by reports that documented successful operations across 6 continents. Each mission represented lives saved, threats neutralized, and national security enhanced through the simple principle of listening to qualified personnel regardless of their position in the hierarchy. The dismissed support analyst had become the CIA's deadliest asset, not through dramatic transformation, but through the recognition that she had always possessed the capabilities that institutional blindness had failed to see. And now, throughout the intelligence community, other overlooked personnel were being given the opportunity to prove that quiet competence could accomplish what loud authority never could. The revolution had begun in a forgotten cubicle where a woman with a mathematics degree and marine combat experience had been relegated to filing quarterly reports. It had succeeded because sometimes the most important battles are won not through overwhelming force, but through the patient application of expertise that refuses to be ignored. The ghost in the machine had become its guardian, and the system had finally learned to trust the human touch. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.